100 children to do. This year the Queen Quet coming to 100 from the Gullah Geechee Garden right up on St. Helena Island and thing like that. Part of we Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition Center. Now another part of we center, the Alkebulan Archive, where plenty of 100 children and give donation to this year. Yeah. Now plenty of other rest of children will come here in March and thing like that and work in the archive. You notice we got plenty of booking things. But one of the most recent one, they're from civil rights to human rights and self-determination. This year, the proceedings of the Chicago Conference, and we did it with Iran. Plenty of 100 children done no sign on the directorate of the International Human Rights Association for American Minorities. This year, our NGO, we got consultative status with the UN. So when we do work, we do it for human rights, especially for the Gullah Geechee and things like that, since I'm the head from the body of the Gullah Geechee Nation. Now, plenty of people who did it not yet me to crack or teeth like this year, because then they meet me in the hall and all the rest of the place, so they'll hear me speak this way. Well, you will hear my voice on this episode as well, speaking this way, speaking to people who have lived through the civil rights era, people who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Many of you are familiar with Stokely Carmichael, who is now the late Kwame Ture. This was a brother that I had many conversations with and appreciated, respected, honored the words that he had to share about what went on in that movement. But more than that, it was an honor for me to sit with these women of the civil rights movement who had been part of SNCC, including our own Gullah Geechee woman, Millicent Brown from up in Charleston, who will share just a bit about their lives, and in particular, a question I asked them about culture and how that played a part in the movement that they participated in and how they see things going forward, because you all know that culture is everything about the movement that we are involved in now in the Gullah Geechee Nation in terms of protecting our human rights and our right to self-determination. I recommend this book, From Civil Rights to Human Rights and Self-Determination, which was actually put forth, published by Clarity Press. You can also get it at gullahgeechee.biz, along with many other books about Gullah Geechee history, heritage, and culture. But Hunter Chillin, even more than having this book, remember, us as human beings are the true archives for our story, our tradition, our heritage, and our culture. So tune in as we go to Penn Center, to the first annual Penn Center Civil Rights Symposium that was ever held in Frizzell Community House, the same building where Dr. King and SCLC used to meet and gather, and where the Poor People's Campaign was first announced. Tune in to this celebration, commemoration, this journey 50 years after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right up on St. Helena Island. Because Hunter Chilla know, if Hunter deal with me, Hunter going know this year the what going on. And this is what was going on, and we pray that the words you take from it will help you for going on and on and on toward freedom for the world, freedom for we people, freedom for all the children were there around you. Hunter Chilla, peace and blessing.
Freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom, oh
through demonstrating through voter registration to use the black power to bring about change. But in the white community, it was in the segregation district, you know, the white community that didn't understand SNCC, what they saw was a call for black power, and it scared them to death and infuriated them. So it's very interesting because it was a call to let's exercise and use our black power. So I just want to say one thing in case I have to go. I was fortunate enough to be the first white woman on the SNCC executive committee, and how that happened was I was out of college, not that much older than the SNCC people, but I was working in Atlanta, and I got to know Ella Baker, got to go to the first SNCC meeting, and they wanted 2 advisors. Julian Baum said the only reason they asked me to be an adult advisor is because I had a mimeograph machine and a postage machine in my office. I thought it was maybe a little talent for that. But anyway, it was Ella Baker and I.
Yeah, resources, exactly.
I was both adult advisors. I think I was 25. And I was an adult advisor. So now I'm going to pass it on to Melissa.
It's on?
It is on.
I think my role on this panel, I certainly hope, is one of doing some bridging, especially with the young people in the audience. Because, and first of all, Barbara, I don't put hero over my name with this. I was a hard-working community organizer that went through a whole bunch of stuff in Mississippi and Georgia, that's true. But the others on the panel were in positions of considerable more responsibility than I ever assumed, and so I'm humbled to even be in their presence. But I agreed to lend my 2 cents to this discussion because I'm so keenly aware, especially as a history professor for so long, about, again, assumptions and misconceptions about the movement. And the part that I want to share with you today is to just always challenge you to remember that these are not frozen moments in time that we're talking about with this movement. And so the hat that I'm wearing today has nothing to do with the school DSEG. See, I come up in an NAACP household in a state very much dominated, South Carolina, by NAACP for most of the 50s and the 60s. And so I already have this political persuasion going, all right, for which I'm very grateful. But I am so glad to get out of this craziness of school DSEG in 1966 that I go north of Freedom, I go to Boston because white folks are different up there, right? So I run into more craziness than I have ever known. And so people are turning over buses because they're desegregating schools, And I have to share with you something that my father always said when I came back very disillusioned after a couple of years. And he said, "Melissa, I told you, the South is anything but no Canada." He had said it many times when I was little, but I didn't understand what he meant until I had gone and experienced Boston. So I leave this predominantly white college because I'm just so unsatisfied. I'm going more and more political by 66. All of the events that you've been hearing about, we've had so many situations occurring. Freedom Summer is over, the whole articulation of the Black Power movement, and I'm just stuck up in Boston and I don't know what to do with it. I need a Black experience, I decide. So I transfer south. I'm going to go to college because my parents want me to stay in school. So I go to Spelman. I'm going to go to a Black school. Well, I'm so alienated at Spelman because there were 8 politically charged students on campus, 8 females at Spelman, who want to take on these issues. Even though the movement is going through some different kinds of issues right now. I get recruited by Jesse Morris to come over to Mississippi. So I have the great fortune in 1969 to be in Mississippi, the place that everybody has talked about, but Mississippi didn't go anywhere, and there are still problems. And so I'm there in SNCC when there are no white members of SNCC. And so I take real great pride in attending conferences like this and others, where the older SNCC people ask me, what was that like after we were gone? And I have a chance to talk a little bit about the good, the bad, the ugly, but the fact that SNCC continued in some perhaps more radicalized times, but we were there trying to make real, or use this expression earlier, we were really trying to make real some of the principles that had been laid down. For example, people suffered greatly from having participated in movement. And so those people who had been thrown off their land, fired from their jobs, found themselves really just caught without any kind of economic base. And so the continuation of SNCC that I was a part of was embodied in what we called the Poor People's Corporation. And one of the initiatives out of the Poor People's Corporation was an operation called Liberty House. And Liberty House in Mississippi and in a couple of places in Alabama set up handicraft cooperatives. All of this is just building on local talent, local initiatives to help people find some kind of an economic base or means of survival because they're being penalized for their political involvement earlier. So I work with Doris Derby, who's been with SNCC forever, and Jess, and I first meet Myrtle Glasgow and Connie. I'm sorry.
In the book. I'm sorry, she is in the book.
Yes, yeah. And so I have the great privilege of this older narrative from people a few years ahead of me, but then I am part of the continuation. And I make a big point of sharing that with you because we cannot ever look back on this movement and just look at the stars. Because I didn't do anything that I would say is deserving, you know, of any great. I was just a hard-working young person. You know, and I'm not going to show up in the books, and that's fine with me. But I say that to those of you, don't get starstruck, because the work was still done by the slow and the steady, and I know my time is about the slow and the steady, but the committed. The slow and the steady and the committed. I had the great benefit of having had a lifelong exposure to political involvement, but SNCC was my community. It radicalized me in many ways. We were not able to grapple with issues of gender. It just did not happen. It was later that I had to look back at, well, were we sexist in SNCC, and you know, those were issues for the late 70s for me. And I became much of a feminist, much of a womanist later on. But I was a part of that last vestige of being a race woman. And I couldn't reconcile fighting for women's rights and racial rights at the same time. I just couldn't do it. I didn't have the tools to do it at the time. But the issue at hand was, are we continuing the work that was done by the greats of mid-century, and how are we making that a part of our lifelong commitment to change? And that got me ready for the gender issues that would come later. And I appreciate every one of those experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. That's just the heat. That's just the heat.
Thank you very much. Has anything more they want to say before we open this up to Q&A? Okay. Can I just mention just one thing? Some of you know I worked on one of the films that I worked on was a 14-hour series of Eyes on the Prize. And so in that, that's where you get a sense of the female, the women who were leaders. And it's the first time I realized, even before this new book that is out on Rosa Parks. By the way, there's a lot of wonderful new scholarship coming out on women in the movement. Yours, Jean P.O. Harris has done this wonderful book on Rosa Parks. Emily Crosby, Dr. Emily Crosby is doing incredible work on women today. But there are a lot of books movement scholarship, really talking about not just the folks up here, but the folks who are doing all this work and stuff. All those local movements books, like Charles Payne's "I've Got the Light of Freedom," or John Dittmer's book. All of those. Local people, thank you, local people. Those books really talk about the role of women. And by the way, the reason we chose the photo that's on here was because I looked through all the archives and found this MUP. I sent it to my other 5 women editors, and we chose this because most of us know that when we got to mass meetings, at least 70% of the people in that mass meeting would be women. And I might mention, when people talk about young people who are coming up now, it's wonderful Albert Sykes, but it's also Maisha Moses, who's sitting down there too, and it is Crystal Madison, who, I mean, these are wonderful women and men, leaders who are young people coming up that we see just really carrying on the continuation of it all. Okay, so, to Q&A, what y'all got to say? Yeah, sorry.
What I didn't get to speak about at all was how I came into a greater awareness of myself and how to do the work that I was doing. After my coworker left, I found myself asking myself how I would do it by myself. Then I found myself coming up with all kinds of ideas, and my inner me coming forward and just blocking. And so I could say that that's when I really began to be aware of myself, say as a woman on my own in that camp, working that whole camp. I'll stop.
And I want to make another comment. I just thought about it, and I asked you if I may add this. In my research, which was mostly about NAACP, because I was looking at South Carolina, and as Millicent said, NAACP dominated South Carolina in the 40s, really 50s and 60s. I found that among the membership, they had more women than men, although the men were the spokespersons and the presidents. When you look at the rank and file, they were women. And I did a lot of research in the Library of Congress and found that to be true in other states as well. So, when you look at your foundation, you're looking at a whole lot of women. And I also found that a lot of them were families, not just one person, but like Millicent's case, the whole family was involved. Just wanted to add that.
Yes.
I had a question in regards to you saying that everyone is not necessarily a leader. Like, I understand that a lot of people were moved by this movement in the 60s. However, there are many women that weren't, which led to future generations of supposedly oppressed women. And today, in my generation, there are a lot of women who really don't know their self-worth and don't know their power. How do we come together without all of us being leaders? Because you can't have everyone being a leader. How do we come together now when there's no movement to encourage some of these women without pushing them against the wall? Because I'm a woman. You can't tell me everything and I don't get offended. I'm going to get offended because I'm a woman. That's just a natural thing. So how do we talk to women our age? How do I talk to other women my age without pushing them against the wall and letting them know you are important without them thinking I'm trying to gang up on them?
It helps if you're not by yourself.
Right.
I mean, one of the things that we had groups. We had folks who thought like we did. You don't want to be around people who are silly people. And I just call them silly people. So somebody's going to tell me, who's that horrible Bobby Brown? Yeah, well, probably the reason that he beat up on, was it Rihanna? Yeah, was because she deserved it. Okay, you don't want to be around people like that.
Chris Brown.
What you do want to do, though, is get enough women and men to say, no, wait a minute, back up. Now, what was interesting to me is what they did on Spelman's campus. Those women said, look, he's not coming on campus.
Right.
And we need to have a dialogue about this. You don't try and do it by yourself. But you got to figure that you're not the only sane person in the world.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank all the panelists for sharing your stories. And I'm Queen Quet. I'm Chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation. Yesterday, Dave Dennis mentioned that in terms of early education, so to speak, the first schools that were started by many Gullah Geechees and so forth in this region, and that was some of the first public school education there was, they realized that people, their children, needed to be immersed in their culture. So in your roles in SNCC, how did culture play a part in what you were doing in terms of educating the community, community engagement, and community activism at that time? And how do you think that that should continue to be utilized as people continue to go forward?
Just anyone speak to that? So I would say that I mentioned early on that the director of the project had suggested that I take my time and get to know the community. So you get to know how things were done and take my time and go around and meet people and see how people thought about things. And observe also ways that things are being done in this community. And that's of paramount importance. And so if you are not, you work to get in sync with the community, with the culture of the community. First of all, to find out what it is and how it may differ from what you do, and make yourself very much able to watch yourself as you're working, and watch how you handle yourself inside the culture. So that's just me.
Again, timing has a lot to do with responding to your question, because the work that we've been talking about, that we call SNCC work, I don't think was heavily based on an African identity, you see. And so when we talk about culture, I think of the culture of the church, the culture of the family, the culture of the community, you know. And so that's the culture that we knew to respect and to honor, okay? Now, when you start talking about when it gets to identity, then that's where me coming up in the late 60s, early 70s, and the whole reclaiming of our sense of being an African people. So we're going, you know, the SNCC people can party now. I'm telling you. we had good times. Believe me, I missed all these other things, you know. And then we're listening to Masakela and Gullah, and we're beginning to dance to African music. And then for women, it's who got the straight hair and who got the natural hair, you know? And so that becomes sort of a defining line of whether or not you see yourself as black and beautiful, or are you just about this so-called political struggle? So, you know, the politics does become personal. And so it's not a straight line to answer your question, but culture just, I think, meant something somewhat different in the midst of the freedom rides and the demonstrations culture versus we as the black people who must accept more holistically ourselves as an African people.
I would also mention, I mean, you come up against two different cultures too, because when we come in with the naturals and the bushes, you know, I remember Mrs. Mrs. Blackwell. You know, the women of that community in Marysville, Mississippi are trying to figure out, how do you tell Muriel Tillinghast that she can't, you know, she really needs to do a little something to her hair before she comes to church, you know. And they're all trying to figure out how to do that in a very nice and sweet way. But they really think she needs to know, because clearly, if she knew, she would straighten her hair, you know. So you get that. But the other thing is, when I come in 63, our slogan is one man, because it was man here, one man, one vote. Now we're getting that from the anti-colonial struggle in Africa. That's a direct lift. And then when John Lewis and not I think the culture you're talking about, and I'll get to that in a second, really quickly. When John Lewis and Mrs. Hamer and a number of folks coming out of that Mississippi struggle at the end of Mississippi Freedom Summer, when Harry Belafonte figures out financing, get a group of about 7 or 8 people, including Ruby Doris Robinson, and Mrs. Hamer, and Mrs. Blackwell, and they go to Kenya? Am I right about that? That's wrong. That is wrong. And it's not Ghana. Tanzania? No, not Tanzania. That's the other group. Well, they go to West Africa. Okay. Guinea, thank you. They go to Guinea. So they go over there, and it's the first time they have seen black people running a country. Right? This is a mind blow for them. But they do that, and there's a connection. John Lewis goes over during that time. He sees Malcolm X. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of the African students had been at the HBCUs, not called that then, during that time. So Julian Bond, whose father is head of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, knows Nkrumah, but he knows him as a student at Lincoln. You know, so there's a lot of cross-fertilization that's going on. In terms of culture, when we start Drum and Spear Bookstore in Washington, D.C., and it becomes the largest black bookstore in the country, that's all SNCC. And it's Drum for culture, and Spear for whatever else you need for the liberation of your people. Okay, so it's all of that going on. And we have the Center for Black Education, and we have you know, the Black Arts Movement. So Haki Madawuni is coming through, and Baraka is coming through, and Sonia Sanchez are coming. They're all coming through that bookstore.
Gotcha.
Black children's books, but that comes in the 70s.
Right.
So when it's what you're talking about. We didn't have that kind of culture.
Consciousness, yeah.
Because you're right, we're based in the culture of the community. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.